Hey, it's Phil from SmilingGardener.com, and I'm really excited to share with you today a blueprint I've been working on for the last couple of days to give you an overview of the most important strategies you can use to improve the health of your garden this year. So I'm going to head over to the computer and I will show you what I'm talking about. So the strategies that you see in front of you here will help you grow a healthy organic garden of any kind that doesn't have pest and weed problems. And the plan is especially tailored to growing highly nutritious, non-toxic food, because that's what gets me so excited. So you can see a bunch of different steps here. And there's no particular order to them because the order you'll do things in depends on your situation. But what I want to do is briefly go through each of the steps so you can see what I'm talking about here. And if you see, I've kind of created a shrub here of some kind, a really interesting looking plant. The bottom half tends to be steps that are more focused on the soil, and the top half tends to be steps that are more focused on the plants directly, but there's a lot of crossover, and so things you do in the soil might be also done to the plants and vice versa. So I'm just going to scroll in here and go through them in kind of the order that makes sense to me, and I hope you enjoy it. So first thing I often want to do in my garden is to discover a little bit about my soil. So what that involves is digging a hole, as I've said before in some of my other writings, and just looking at your soil texture and structure, learning what that means, counting the earthworms and insects in there to get an idea of what you have going on in terms of micro animal activity, and then looking at the organic matter, putting some water into the hole and seeing how it infiltrates and how it drains. And learning this basic stuff can really help you figure out what kinds of plants you're going to be designing into your garden, what kind of fertilizers to use. It'll help you figure out a watering schedule, what kind of other amendments to be bringing into your garden. It's a great first step to helping you design and plan your garden. And then if you want to get into more detailed, especially if you're growing food and you really want it to be highly nutritious and free of pests, it's worthwhile to look at the chemistry. And for that, we want to take a good soil sample and send it to a good organic soil lab. What you can do is analyze those results yourself if you learn how to do that, or pay them for their recommendations. And then you can apply very specific fertilizers based on those soil results that will help bring your soil into a balance that is more conducive to soil life and plant life, because we need to have the nutrients in our soil in specific ratios. Also, if you think your soil might have contamination for any reason, it's worthwhile to test that through a soil lab as well, and then you can take steps to remedy that. Then another interesting one is biology, and this isn't as popular, but it's becoming more and more popular, which is to take that same soil sample and send it to a good biology lab, and then see what you're dealing with in your soil in terms of beneficial bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and nematodes. And then what you can do is make very specific composts or compost teas to create a better biological balance in your soil for what you're trying to grow, because different types of plants are going to want to grow with different biology in the soil. So this is really fascinating. This is where gardening is heading, and it's worthwhile doing this. Then we get into preparing a bed, perhaps. So preparing a bed, just some things you want to think about are, do you want to double dig your soil to incorporate compost and fertilizers to get them down into that root zone? Or do you want to go and work more on top of the soil with a mulch, maybe a sheet mulch or a rock mulch? That's a decision to make, and you can also do both. You can also decide if you want to remove the sod or not, and what kind of an edge you're going to put on the bed to keep weeds out of the bed. And then there is, if you have extreme soils, like a very heavy clay or sand, you're going to want to amend that with compost and specific fertilizers. And then we get into the specifics of composting, for example. So you can buy a compost if you can find a nice smelling, nice looking compost in your area, or you can make one yourself with a very diverse array of ingredients, and you can make a really beautiful compost that way. It could just be a worm compost that you make in a bin inside your house on a small scale, or a bokashi compost that you can do on a small scale, or it could be a bigger compost pile that you're making outside. And no matter what kind of compost you make, what I've learned through research over the years is that we actually don't want to apply much. We want to apply it to the soil, or to the mulch, this should say, maximum a 1/4 inch of compost, because it's going to bring in beneficial biology that I've talked about and the beneficial broad spectrum array of nutrients. But if we use too much, we're going to bring in too much of specific nutrients such as potassium that actually are going to cause compaction in our soil and other deficiencies. So just a little bit of good compost is all we want. Then it comes to cover crops, which are also really beneficial for improving soil structure and fertility, controlling weeds, inviting in beneficial insects and animals, while sometimes even controlling the harmful insects and diseases, bringing in organic matter and conserving water. It does many good things to have a cover crop in the off season or even during the growing season. And for that, legumes are going to be the best, sometimes grasses as well, and maybe even other crops as well. Sometimes you can even grow a cover crop that provides you with food. Then we're on to fertilizing, which we usually just do a little bit of, but it can have such a huge impact on creating health in plants so that we don't have the pest problems, and also in creating really highly nutritious food. And for that, we might go to the ocean to get seaweed and ocean water. These are highly nutritious things to bring into a garden. From land, we're going to use different kinds of rocks, such as a rock dust or even more specific rocks based on the nutrients we know we need to bring in, and that's when a soil test comes in. From your kitchen, I like to do as much stuff as I can using my own materials. So molasses can be very helpful sprayed on plants. Coffee grounds are a great source of nitrogen and other nutrients. Make your own. Urine is something that scares some people, but is really a great fertilizer for the garden. Herbal teas you can make are really useful. So there are some fertilizers there. And those are the main things I think about when improving my soil. Then when it comes up above ground, well, design is going to be an important part of the process at some point. And so for that, what you first want to do is make sure you're spending some time keeping track of the sun at different times of day in your garden, and the temperature, maybe where the snow melts first and where it stays the longest. Looking at moisture, where it stays the longest and where it's very dry on your property. Those are all going to have a huge impact on your design. Then you want to think about the goals for each person in your house, for how they want the garden to look, aesthetics, how they want to use your property and your garden, and what you want to do to improve the ecology on your yard, how you want to improve the ecosystem there. Then you can draw the site to scale on graph paper and make some copies, and that's when you can really start to draw multiple bubble diagrams, we call them, and then to draw several designs. And when you have a bunch of copies, you can feel free to really draw a bunch of different things and see what's going to make the most sense. If you're growing food, there are things to think about there, such as building raised beds. Do you want to build raised beds, or do you want to plan to plant right in the ground? Both have their uses. Do you want to grow vegetables, or do you want to also include hopefully herbs, because they're incredibly beneficial, and fruits as well have their benefits? Designing polycultures, which is a mix of different plants like the ones I mentioned above, and eventually you can even plant a forest garden, which is where we are kind of mimicking a young forest, but using plants that are really beneficial to us, especially food plants. You can plan to extend the growing season into winter with cold frames and hoop houses, and you can plan to harvest seeds in the summer and fall and dry them. Sometimes it's good to ferment them and save them. And that's something some people don't do in the beginning, which is fine, but it's a good thing to learn how to do, because it's going to be key to growing really nutritious food and food that doesn't have problems with pests. You want to plan for succession planning, so you have always food to harvest throughout the year, and crop rotation across the years, so that there are just many benefits from rotating crops, as I've talked about in the last few days. Also, growing in containers. I'm going to be doing some of that this year, both inside and outside. Is a really fun thing to do as well. Then we get into planting. So with planting, you're going to want to learn how to choose plants and seeds from garden centers and online. And even if you're buying seed online, try to find it locally if you can. Locally, even just meaning in your kind of part of the world, so your state or province, just because that seed is going to be better adapted to your climate and growing conditions. Eventually, you're going to want to hopefully start some seeds indoors under fluorescent lights and in some kind of organic potting mix, whether you buy that or make it yourself. And that, again, is really key to growing nutrient-dense food, is starting your own seeds and seeds you've saved yourself. You can also sow seed directly outdoors, the timing of which will be based on the last frost dates for your area. which you can find online. And then you're going to want to plant various herbaceous plants and shrubs and trees to get a bunch of diversity. And that's where the forest gardening is fascinating, if we're planting all of these things together in kind of a forest. Then when it comes to managing our plants, inoculants have been hugely helpful in my garden to establish the beneficial biology on plants and on the soil. Of course, compost is the best for this, but we don't always have enough compost. So compost tea is really useful. And the thing about compost tea is we can spray it onto plant leaves, and there's so much benefit to having it on there. We can buy and activate and use effective microorganisms and also mycorrhizal fungi and other inoculants, including inoculants we make ourselves. When it comes to pests, we can, of course, manage them directly with things like homemade garlic sprays and hot pepper sprays, and neem oil is my new favorite. And then we can manage weeds with things like, just as examples, vinegar, just acetic acid, mulch, and a hoe, of course, trusty old hoe. But more importantly, what I really like to teach for long-term working with pests and weeds is to learn about why they're there. So that means learning about the soil food web and the arboreal food web. And most important is to manage garden health directly with all these things I've been talking about. So compost and mulch and cover crops, fertilizers and water. If we can create garden health, then pests are going to be a thing of the past. And I've seen that in my garden and my clients' gardens, and it's really, really fascinating to watch. I've also just put a couple of odds and ends up here. Pruning is something we don't have to do very often at all if we've designed well, but sometimes a little bit of pruning is helpful. And then watering is really important in your garden. Watering deeply and infrequently, something we definitely want to make sure we're doing. Sometimes there's a little bit of tying and staking and tending to the garden that has to happen. If we're trying to maximize our yields, it's something like, for example, a tomato. If you have lots of space, a tomato can grow along the ground just fine. But if you have time to tie them up, you're going to get better yields, and they're going to be less susceptible to issues with pests and with soil splashing on them and all of that. So it can be useful to do that if you want, also not necessary. Also getting into biodynamic tree paste, which you can make and apply to your trees, and other biodynamic and other energetic things that we make can be really useful for plant health. So you can see there's a lot of things to learn here. I think it's fascinating. But this is, the strategies here are what have really helped me grow a highly nutritious organic garden that's healthy and free of pest problems. And as you can see, I have them kind of grouped here down below and grouped here up above. It's a lot to learn, but it's what my Academy members, hundreds of Academy members, have been learning over the years and implementing in their own gardens to get the same kind of benefits that I've been getting in my own garden. And so I hope this blueprint is really helpful for you. You can actually download it and even print it off, put it on your fridge if you want. And I hope what it does is opens your eyes to a new way of thinking about your garden, because once you put these strategies into place, things are never quite the same. Once you do some chemistry testing, some biology testing, making really good compost, doing cover cropping and fertilizing, things change tremendously in your garden. And what happens is you'll still have occasional setbacks, because nature is, of course, a very complex, dynamic, ever-changing system, and we don't have control over nature. But if we can learn to work with nature, the setbacks become much less frequent, and they're balanced by astonishing successes in the garden. What I hope is that some people will take this blueprint and use it as a jump-off point to learning about the things they need to do to improve the health of their garden this year. And if you do that, I have just one really important piece of advice, which is to make sure you're looking at multiple sources of information when you're researching each of the topics in the blueprint, because there is a lot of poor information that gets passed around in the gardening world, including the organic gardening world, and especially online. So if you just make sure you find multiple sources of information and you really try to figure out what makes the most sense, and then you try it out, a bit of trial and error, you'll gradually find your way. I've been researching online since 2005. That's when I went and started gardening organically, and I've been teaching for a long time, and I've just seen that you really have to be kind of careful and make sure you're thoroughly researching and finding the right information. If you really like my approach, if it resonates with you and you want to implement it in your garden, there's still time for you also to join my online gardening course, the Smiling Gardener Academy, and really learning this blueprint from A to Z, step by step. And I'll actually put some information for you down below where you can read more about the Academy. But I'll also tell you a little bit today about it because I have some really good news. And that is that I'm in the process of giving the Academy a bit of a makeover right now, as I do every year, just to make it as useful as I can and to incorporate some new research I've been finding, and just to always update it is what I like to do every year. And I like to get some feedback when I do that. And I could use some help for you. So from you, if you are willing to do a few surveys, take a few surveys during the course to give me some feedback, I want to thank you with a huge discount, a 30% discount on the course, which I know is really huge, but it's really helpful for me to get feedback. And what you can do if you're interested in that, I'm going to give this to 30 people. So the next 30 people who register, you can go, and when you're checking out, you can enter the gift certificate, thanks, on the checkout page when you're registering, just above where you enter your address. And that way you'll get 30% off, and I'll be able to send you some surveys and really get some useful information. It's really great for you, it's really great for me, and I just feel really good about doing that. Otherwise, I just hope you've enjoyed the blueprint, and you can go and make use of it for yourself. And if you want to register for the Academy, make sure you do it by Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm really excited to get better acquainted with you in there and help you out with your garden. And that's all for now. Take care.